What if I told you that the deadliest war of the 20th century, a conflict that reshaped nations and consumed tens of millions of lives, was also the stage for one of history's most silent, ruthless mating markets? A marketplace where the laws of attraction were not written by generals or politicians, but by women forced to navigate the chaos of collapse, and by men who either fit their new criteria for survival or were discarded without ceremony. Declassified government files, soldiers' letters, and even diaries reveal something chilling when the world itself was burning. Biology did not hesitate. It revealed the raw, unfiltered truth about desire, loyalty, and the fragile conditions on which love truly rests. Picture the world in 1942. Europe, Asia, and the Pacific are engulfed in fire. For the young men fighting, life has been reduced to its barest elements. The battle for survival and the dream of home. American GIs crouched in icy foxholes in the Ardennes, their hands stiff on rifle bolts, praying they wouldn't freeze before dawn. British pilots scanned gray skies for the faint buzz of enemy aircraft, knowing that the next shadow might be the last thing they ever saw. Across the Pacific, Marines listened for the low drone of approaching engines, each one carrying the promise of death. Their world was mud, metal, and terror, and yet, in that world, they clung to something softer, a memory, a talisman, an image of a girl back home, a small photograph tucked in a breast pocket, creased from battle and kissed in secret, a perfume-scented letter that promised devotion, a fragile hope that while the world descended into madness, love would remain untouched. For many, she was not just a sweetheart. She was the anchor that gave them the strength to push through unimaginable horror. Soldiers imagined her in a factory, working at a rivet gun with her hair tied back, her heart loyal and steadfast. They pictured her penning letters by lamplight, her love constant, a beacon in the blackout. This was not just personal fantasy. It was encouraged. Governments and media fueled the story of the faithful sweetheart, the Penelope waiting patiently for her Odysseus to return from war. It made sacrifice noble. It softened the sharp edges of steel and blood. It gave meaning to suffering. But history, stripped of sentimentality, shows us another reality. The reality that for many women, the war was not only a time of waiting, it was the greatest romantic opportunity of their lives. When normal structures collapsed, instincts long restrained by convention surged to the surface. To understand why, we must first grasp a term often loaded with politics, but at its root, purely biological, hypergamy, derived from the Greek, hyper meaning above, and gamos, meaning marriage. It describes the instinct to seek a partner of equal or, ideally, higher status. This is not a cultural invention. It is not even a moral issue. As evolutionary psychologist David Buss wrote, across time and across cultures, women consistently prefer partners who can offer resources, protection, and stability. Hypergamy is not about greed. It is about survival. It is the ancient current beneath human courtship, ensuring that offspring are tied to security and upward mobility. In stable societies, hypergamy is often constrained by class, geography, and family expectations. It operates slowly, subtly, as women weigh prospects within familiar boundaries. But when those boundaries vanish in an instant, when death visits daily, when millions of men vanish overseas, when strangers in uniform suddenly appear with resources, power, and the aura of danger, that slow current transforms into a tidal wave. World War II did not invent hypergamy. It unleashed it. It gave it speed, urgency, and a vast new playing field. On the home front, the transformation was swift. With so many men deployed, women stepped into factories, offices, and farms in unprecedented numbers. They earned their own wages, enjoyed new independence, and tasted freedoms denied to their mothers. Yet with this freedom came an aching void, the absence of familiar men, the farm boys, the shop clerks, the mechanics, all gone. A profound anxiety grew, the fear of missing their chance in the prime years of life, of being left behind while others secured their future. And then, into this vacuum, came the soldiers, not the local boys they had grown up alongside, but men transfigured by war itself. A sergeant who might have been just a farmhand in 1941 now stood cloaked in the glamour of a uniform, his survival skill honed in fire. The pilot, the commando, the GI, they weren't just men. They were symbols of vitality and power in a collapsing world. They brought gifts that ration books could not buy: chocolate, silk stockings, cigarettes, nylon. But more than that, they brought a promise. They embodied the winning side. Aligning with them meant aligning with survival, with a future beyond scarcity. The philosopher Nietzsche once wrote, "All living beings do everything possible to preserve themselves." For women in wartime, aligning with men who radiated survival and status wasn't betrayal. It was a strategy written deep in the nervous system. The faithful sweetheart mythology dissolved in the face of this primal calculation. The war created a perfect storm where biology, opportunity, and desperation converged. And here's where the story turns darker, because while some men clung to the fantasy of unconditional loyalty, others discovered that loyalty had become conditional, fragile, and relentlessly recalibrated. The question is, what happened when these men came home? What happened when the ones who survived returned expecting love, only to find the rules of the game had been rewritten in their absence? If the myth of the sweetheart sustained men on the battlefield, what they found on their return shattered more than their illusions. It reshaped entire societies. And the most brutal part, this was just the beginning. The real story isn't found in the photograph tucked into a soldier's pocket. It begins with the choices women made when the war ended. When the victors stood tall and the defeated were left in ruins. The statistics tell a story that sentiment often hides. During the war years, marriage rates didn't merely rise, they exploded. Across the United States, ceremonies took place at a pace no demographer had predicted. Some couples rushed to the altar just days before deployment, desperate to secure bonds before uncertainty carried one partner thousands of miles away. Newspapers of the time documented panic marriages, a phrase that captured both the fear of separation and the urgency of securing someone before the window of opportunity closed. Behind every hurried kiss and signed license was the looming shadow of mortality. To love in wartime meant to race against the clock. Yet the most striking data comes not from these rushed weddings, but from what followed. In 1945, the U.S. government passed the War Brides Act, followed by the Fiancé Act, to accommodate the tidal wave of foreign women marrying American servicemen. Over 100,000 women from Britain alone migrated as war brides, while tens of thousands more came from Australia, Canada, France, Italy, and even Germany. Imagine the scale of this. Entire villages in England losing swaths of young women to departing American GIs, their absence leaving visible scars on local communities. For the women, it was not merely about romance. It was about aligning with the men who represented abundance, security, and the promise of a better future. The British government itself grew alarmed. Classified reports revealed deep concern that young women were being siphoned away en masse by American soldiers, whose higher pay, easy access to luxuries, and air of confidence made them irresistible. Chocolate and nylons may seem trivial to us now, but in a world of ration books and scarcity, they symbolized something profound: the ability to provide. They were tokens of survival and indicators of status. A young woman weighing her options could see clearly which direction the tide of power was flowing. But the numbers only tell half the story. The real pain lies in the words of men who returned home. The archives are filled with letters that capture heartbreak in raw ink. Consider Private James Miller of Ohio. Throughout his service, he wrote faithfully to Mary, his high school sweetheart. He sketched out dreams of the home they would build, even drawing the porch swing where they'd one day sit together. He carried her photograph through every battle, the image so worn it cracked along the edges. He survived the Battle of the Bulge, endured frostbite and shell fire, and finally boarded a train home. Believing love had been his anchor, But when he arrived at her door, flowers in hand, he found another man standing behind her, a bomber pilot she had met at a USO dance. They had already married. James had fought through hell for a dream that evaporated in a single moment. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was repeated countless times in variations across America, Britain, and beyond. For many soldiers, the cruelty came not upon returning home, but in the battlefield itself, through the infamous Dear John letters. These were not just breakups. They were death sentences for morale. Imagine a soldier in the Pacific, filthy and exhausted, clutching an envelope he has been longing for. He recognizes his fiancée's handwriting, opens the letter with shaking hands, only to read the words, "I'm sorry. I've met someone else. I can't wait any longer. I hope you understand." The paper slips from his fingers as his comrades stand in silence, knowing the weight of what just happened. His life had not yet been claimed by the war, but his hope had just been destroyed. Military commanders knew the damage such letters could cause. Some officers intercepted and delayed them, fearing that despair would render soldiers reckless, even suicidal. A single letter written in comfort at home could ripple across a battlefield, weakening resolve, shattering unit cohesion, and endangering lives. In that sense, hypergamy didn't just affect private hearts, it influenced the machinery of war itself. But here's where we must pause and reflect. Can we really call this betrayal in the way the wounded men saw it? Or was it something colder, yet more rational? From a Darwinian perspective, these women were optimizing for survival and future security, aligning with a higher status man, or one who wasn't at risk of dying in combat. Was a strategy, not a cruelty, as brutal as it sounds. Loyalty in wartime was conditional, love was contingent. A woman tethered her future not to sentiment, but to who could provide and protect when everything around her was crumbling. And what is most unsettling is how familiar this logic still feels today. Think of the dating landscape in the modern world. Financial stability, social status, and future prospects still weigh heavily on women's choices, whether on dating apps or in marriages strained by hardship. A man who loses his job often finds his relationship unraveling, not because love was fake, but because love itself is tied to the same ancient calculus. The war only magnified what is always present, hidden beneath the surface of polite society. The question that lingers is haunting. If this was the reality among the victors, men returning home to betrayal, women rushing into marriages with those they perceived as stronger, what happened in the lands of the defeated? If American GIs could command devotion with chocolate and cigarettes, what choices did women face in cities reduced to rubble, where survival itself was on the line? The battlefield of love didn't end with victory parades. In many ways, it only grew darker once the bombs stopped falling, for it was in the ruins of Germany and Japan that hypergamy revealed its most ruthless, most unforgiving form. When the war ended in 1945, the world did not breathe a sigh of relief. For the victors, yes, there was weary triumph and a slow return to normal life. But for the defeated, the end of combat was the beginning of a new kind of suffering. Cities lay in rubble. In Germany, the concept of Stunde Null, 0 hour, took hold. The recognition that the slate had been wiped clean, that the past was erased, and life would now be measured in calories, cigarettes, and scraps of coal. Japan was even more devastated. Entire neighborhoods had been vaporized by firebombing. The divine emperor, once thought a god, had renounced his divinity. The Japanese people were not merely defeated, they were spiritually annihilated. In this landscape, women faced a brutal calculus. Their men were dead, crippled, or broken by captivity. Those who returned often came home shattered, unemployed, and stigmatized. A German man in 1945 was not seen as a hero, but as a pariah. To be Japanese was to embody a failed divine mandate. These men could offer nothing but shared hunger and shame. Against this backdrop stood the victors. American, British, and Soviet troops held everything of value: food, medicine, fuel, cigarettes. A single GI handing a can of rations to a starving child wielded more power than 100 speeches. In the words of one historian, the occupiers were gods because they controlled life itself. Fraternization was officially forbidden at first. Allied command feared security breaches, black markets, and moral collapse. But the orders proved impossible to enforce. The pull was gravitational. Lonely soldiers sought comfort. Women sought survival. In the ruins, attraction was not about romance, but necessity. One haunting photograph captures the moment perfectly. A young German woman, hair perfectly styled, walks arm in arm with a smiling American soldier through a street of rubble. Behind them, gaunt German men watch in silence. Their faces show not anger, but defeat. They had lost the war. They had lost their future. And now, they were losing the women of their nation, one by one, to the victors. Japan saw an even more complex and tragic manifestation. The Pan girls emerged as symbols of desperation and strategy. Many came from once respected families destroyed by the war, reduced to poverty. They sought out American soldiers not only for a meal or a few cigarettes, but for something larger, a chance at marriage, a ticket out of devastation. The very term pan is thought to echo the sound of hands slapping together in transaction. But this was no ordinary prostitution. These women were not simply selling themselves for short-term survival. They were auditioning, presenting themselves as potential wives, attempting to secure long-term security for themselves and, if possible, for their families. They studied English. They adopted American manners. They crafted the illusion of domesticity for men far from home. One story preserved in oral histories illustrates this perfectly. Hyoko, the daughter of an aristocratic Tokyo family, saw her entire world collapse when her father committed ritual suicide after Japan's surrender. Left destitute with her mother and younger sister, she witnessed neighbors form bonds with American soldiers and return with food, medicine, even protection from harassment. One afternoon, a young American officer asked her for directions. She spoke a few words of English. He was polite, well-fed, and clearly powerful. In that moment, she made a choice. She cultivated the relationship with precision, cooking with whatever she could find, practicing English, presenting herself as a refuge from the soldiers' lonely posting. Within a year, she was married and on her way to California. Was this betrayal of her culture? Or was it the highest act of loyalty, removing one mouth to feed and creating a lifeline for her family's survival? The answer depends on where you stand. For her, it was not about love, but about strategy. The children born of these unions were living proof of Hypergamy's brutal efficiency. In Germany, they were called Besatzungskinder, occupation children. Many grew up ostracized, reminders of humiliation, belonging to neither side. In Japan, they were nicknamed occupation babies. Their existence was complicated, but their very survival testified to the success of their mothers' choices. By aligning with victors, these women ensured their bloodlines link to the winning tribe, securing for their children what their defeated men could not provide. What strikes us here is not the betrayal, but the clarity. When civilization collapsed, pretense disappeared. Women were not moved by hatred toward the enemy who had destroyed their cities. Hatred feeds the spirit, but it does not feed children. They looked at the men who now controlled survival and aligned accordingly. Hypergamy, stripped of romance and illusion, operated with a cold, Darwinian brilliance. As one survivor later said, it was not love, it was hunger. At this point, the picture is nearly unbearable. Soldiers who survived battlefields returned home to find themselves abandoned. Women in defeated nations chose the arms of the enemy rather than starve with their own countrymen. This is the heart of darkness, not war itself, but what war reveals about the human condition. And yet, to stop here would miss the deeper lesson, because these choices are not confined to history. They echo into our own time, into every crisis, every divorce court, every dating app. And this leads us to the most devastating truth of all, that loyalty is never unconditional, and love is always contingent. What the rubble of 1945 revealed is the same truth that governs relationships today. To see it clearly requires courage, To ignore it is to risk becoming the man who fights, sacrifices, and returns only to find himself replaced by someone stronger. The question we must ask is simple. If this was the reality when nations burned, what does it mean for men living now, in a world that feels safe but hides crises waiting to erupt? What the war bride phenomenon ultimately reveals is not confined to the ruins of Europe or the ashes of Japan. It is a mirror held up to human nature itself. The truth that emerged from 1945 is one men have always suspected, but rarely dared to face without the veil of comforting illusions. Loyalty is conditional, love is contingent, and a man's value is not a permanent possession, but a status that must be constantly proven. The German soldier who was celebrated as a defender of his homeland in 1941 became, by 1945, a symbol of shame. His courage, his sacrifice, even his suffering meant nothing in the hypergamous equation. His status collapsed, and with it, his claim on devotion. Meanwhile, the American GI, who may have been ordinary back home, suddenly embodied victory, resources, and security. His intrinsic qualities mattered less than the uniform he wore and the power it represented. This is the essence of what today is called the black pill. The sober recognition that what men hope for in love is always filtered through the ruthless logic of survival and status. Nietzsche once observed, "There is always some madness in love, but there is also always some reason in madness. The madness is our yearning for unconditional devotion. The reason is biology's unrelenting calculation. When crisis strips away the theater of romance, women's choices reveal a strategy as old as humanity itself. For the modern man, this lesson is not meant to breed despair, but awareness. The same forces that operated in 1945 still operate today, though often in slower, more concealed ways. Consider the man who loses his job. Overnight, the respect of his partner may erode. Her patience wanes, arguments multiply. Or think of the man who neglects his health, drifting into depression or aimlessness. Suddenly, the bond that seemed unshakable becomes fragile. Why? Because hypergamy does not rest. It continuously recalibrates to current reality. What you were yesterday is irrelevant. What you are today determines whether loyalty endures. We see echoes of the war bride logic in modern arenas. Dating apps where women filter by status signals. Divorce courts where financial stability and provision are decisive. Even casual relationships, where the man who projects strength and mission attracts, while the one who falters repels. It may not be bombs and ration books anymore, but the underlying instinct has not changed. As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins wrote, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." The same programming that once led women to align with victors in occupied cities now influences choices in coffee shops, offices, and digital swipes. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, writing during a time of war and plague, reminded himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." For men today, this means accepting that you cannot change the ancient calculus of attraction. What you can change is yourself. You can build, maintain, and project value in a world that never stops measuring it. The lesson is harsh, but it is liberating. You are not entitled to loyalty. You must earn it, moment by moment, through your mission, your resilience, and your capacity to lead. Does this mean love is an illusion? Not entirely. Love exists, but it is never detached from context. Even in wartime, many women remained faithful, endured scarcity, and honored their commitments. But to assume such devotion is universal is to set yourself up for devastation. The wiser course is to see loyalty as something that thrives when your strength, stability, and direction give it a foundation. When those collapse, so does the bond. So what should a man do with this knowledge? He must live as though his fortress of value is not for anyone else, but for himself. He builds his body not to impress, but to remain strong. He sharpens his mind not for applause, but for clarity. He pursues his mission not for validation, but because a man without a mission is already defeated. A woman may join him in that fortress, sharing in its security, but she is not the reason it stands. As the philosopher Schopenhauer warned, a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. Your freedom lies in constructing a life so strong that you remain the actor, not the one acted upon. The war brides of history. From English girls following GIs, to German women walking through rubble, to Japanese pan girls trading desperation for strategy, were not villains. They were survivalists. They played the oldest game with ruthless efficiency. Their choices command not hatred, but a grim respect. They remind us that in human relations, there are no spectators. There are only players and pieces on the board. The choice is whether you will play or whether you will be played. And so we return to the haunting image, a soldier standing in the ruins, watching the woman he thought was his future walk away with another man. He is not unloved because he was unworthy. He is unloved because he was defeated. The war is over, but the lesson endures. In the theater of life, status is never permanent. Loyalty is never unconditional. And your value is only as strong as the fortress you continue to build. The silence that fell in 1945 was not peace. It was revelation. It was the brutal unveiling of what desire really is when stripped of illusions. And that silence still echoes today in every breakup, every betrayal, every moment when a man wonders why devotion slipped through his fingers. The answer was written in rubble long ago. The war is over, but the test is eternal. Will you stand as the actor, fortified in strength? Or will you watch from the ruins as the world moves on without you?